we are going to pick up now talking about Leibniz. We've discussed this guy, Descartes. Leibniz is the fellow with the best hair on the slide. Here's a statue that stands of him. As the group that did the biography on him, I think, did a pretty good job of emphasizing that Leibniz is not just like good at one thing. He is unequivocally and unquestionably an enormous genius. And probably the reason why we are studying his philosophy today is because, without a doubt, he was a genius. And what we are struggling to do is make sense of it. If someone like me were to write the exact same things he wrote, and he never existed, nobody would care, because they would look at that and say, "There's no way this works. Like this is crazy." If Leibniz writes it, though, then we were like, "There's got to be something more to this, and we just don't get it." That's the kind of person he is. He's just it's just hard to fathom the extent of his genius. To invent calculus on your own says quite a bit. And he was a man of great accomplishments outside of mathematics as well. So, truly an independent and original thinker, somebody that is just creative and intelligent in so many ways. The first thing we're going to be looking at is his book, Primary Truth. Well, it's not even really a book, right? It's like a really short paper, which is nice. The nice thing so you'll notice the dates of this piece and the next piece and the third piece we're reading, they're all spaced out by roughly 10 years. We're getting... Maybe I should say this. We don't have a systematic work that Leibniz wrote. Leibniz never sat down and wrote down, like, here is my beginning to end philosophy, starting from the very beginning and explaining from all the little pieces to how it all comes together as a whole. The closest thing we have to that, as the group emphasized, is something like the monadology, what you're going to be reading next for class after spring break. So what we have instead are a bunch of little fragments of things he's written. And each of these fragments kind of focuses on one aspect or another. They're written in different times. So we don't ever get the big picture from Leibniz. So what we're trying to do is piece together a big picture philosophy out of these little bits. We're going to get a nice start on it this week. And then next week, we are going to see at least maybe the most full and developed picture that we have in one piece. But studying these first readings is kind of a nice way to ease into it and try to understand it. Some of the themes that we're going to get from him is the struggle to understand freedom, determinism, and problems of causation, very similar to where we ended in our last class, the last session. He is an anti-Cartesian in the sense that he doesn't think that the essence of matter is extension. He is a rationalist, like Descartes. And in fact, he thinks that the ability to reason is the way to solve a whole host of problems. And as I keep referring to this, but as the group that just presented emphasized, he also was really into trying to resolve conflicts between religious factions. He tried to resolve problems between the Protestants and the Catholics. He tried to resolve problems between the Lutherans and the Calvinists. He thought that if we could just get everyone to sit down and think logically, we wouldn't have conflicts and problems. Where we're going to be moving to is this idea of monads. He calls them different things in the readings that we have this week. True unities, atoms of substance. What he's looking at are these things that he thinks are unique, fundamental substances that compose everything, and they are, by their essence, immaterial. And then finally, another big theme of his philosophy is the idea of pre-established harmony. that there is no real causal interaction between anything. But it's just by God's perfect planning that everything fits together and in a way where it would be just like it would if they did causally interact. We're going to see more about what all this means. So he starts off his piece on primary truths with the idea of telling you what a primary truth is. He says a primary truth is an identity. When you say A is A, or everything is as it is, or nothing is greater or less than itself. These are all things that are just like saying, that are just statements of identity. And he gives them these other negative examples too, if you look at that. Like, it is false that A is not A, or A is not A, things like that. But they're essentially all equivalent. Let's take a look on page 265, and let's look at where he's going to go with this. The second paragraph on the page, so this is on the left-hand side, and let's talk about what he's trying to say about the nature of truth. So he's going to put forward a way to think about how to define truth. All right. So he says, all remaining truths are reduced to primary truths with the help of definitions. That is, through the resolution of notions. In this consists a priori proof. Proof independent of experience. Sorry. You know what? I think the paragraph I want to read is on the right-hand side, now that I'm looking at this. Look on the right-hand side, starting with therefore. Therefore, the predicate or consequent is always in the subject or the antecedent, and the nature of truth in general, or the connection between the terms of a statement, consists in this very thing. As Aristotle also observed, the connection and inclusion of the predicate in the subject is explicit in identities, but in all other propositions it is implicit and must be shown through the analysis of notions. A priori demonstrations rest on this. So what he's saying is truth is this, that all truths, maybe I was reading the right thing. So this does take us to what I've read in the first place. All truths are either primary truths or reducible is the word he uses. Maybe what he means is derivable. I'm not exactly sure how to take that. From primary truths with the help of definitions. So one way to think about what he's saying here is that everything is either a truth that states identity, or with the help of some basic definitions, you can derive any other truth from primary truths. The other thing, which is the second thing I jumped to, was this, that he's giving us what is sometimes called a concept containment theory of truth. A proposition is true if and only if the predicate is contained within the subject. You might say, what does that even mean? Here are maybe some attempts to give you some examples. So think about the statement, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Hopefully you all know that that is a true statement. What makes that true? Leibniz says what makes it true is that the idea of a bachelor contains within it the idea of being an unmarried man. Here's another way to get it. A dog is an animal. Why is that true? Because the idea of a dog contains within it, among other features, that it is an animal. And green is a color, the same thing. The idea of green includes within itself the idea that it is a color. So if a predicate is contained within a subject, that is what makes it true. That is how we know things are true, is when the predicate is contained within the subject matter. So there are going to be things that we can figure out like this that are just matters of identity. And these are the ones down here I think we would say come out from considerations of identity. The harder question is how do we do this with things that are not identities? I think that he thinks as we learn more about things, we can do more of this. we'll just have to see how this plays out a little bit in his philosophy. Are there questions about what he means by a primary truth, or what he means, or what we're talking about with the concept containment theory of truth? The second thing is maybe didn't explain perfectly clear. I don't know. So he gives us one of his famous principles on 266. Here he doesn't call it the principle of sufficient reason, but you should think in your head, like maybe a little note here, because he's going to talk about this principle in the other writings. So let's take a look at this first paragraph on 266. So after talking about primary truths, concept theory of containment, the concept containment theory of truth, he then says, many things of great importance follow from these considerations. Considerations insufficiently attended to because of their obviousness. For the received axiom that nothing is without reason, or there is no effect without a cause, directly follows from these considerations. So those italicized phrases there, nothing is without reason, there is no effect without a cause, those are thought of, these might be ways to state the principle of sufficient reason. We're going to see other versions later. It says that that principle follows directly from what we just read on the other page. So he goes on and tries to sketch out a brief argument for how you can derive this principle of sufficient reason from primary truths and the concept containment of truth. So the principle of sufficient reason, as we said, nothing is without reason, or there is no effect without a cause. And here's the sort of short proof he gives of this. And what I have up here is just sort of the basic idea. If there was a truth that had no reason for it being true, then it would violate his concept containment theory of truth. There would be no subject that didn't have the predicate contained within it. So here's how this works. All truths consist of propositions whose predicate is contained within its subject. To allow that something has no cause or reason implies that there is a truth whose subject does not contain its predicate. After all, nothing cannot be part of a subject. Therefore, everything must have a sufficient cause or reason for its being true. This is another kind of interesting thing to look at. I don't want to dwell too much on this particular argument today, but if you find this compelling or interesting, or if you're puzzled by it, there's a lot of things you could look at for your paper in this class that would just look into how this argument goes. How Leibniz is trying to establish that there is a principle of sufficient reason. Another important principle he gives us is in the next paragraph, the principles of identity. I'm not going to read the paragraph, but the way that this plays out is in this quote here, that there cannot be two things that differ in number alone. And this follows from the principle of sufficient reason, he thinks. That there always has to be some sufficient reason why they are different, and that that explanation must derive from some difference they contain. Otherwise, if you just had two things that were exactly alike, but you just said, well, this is one thing and this is another thing, that wouldn't explain why they're different. That wouldn't explain the differences that they have. There's got to be some deeper explanation. So he goes on to say in this very same paragraph that there are no two things that are exactly alike. Like no two blades of grass, no two leaves. No two things are ever exactly alike. Everything is unique. If everything was not unique, then it would violate the principle of sufficient reason, which he said follows necessarily from his concept containment of truth. So once again, maybe one way to think about Leibniz as we understand him better, when he starts saying some really crazy things, maybe it's because he believes they necessarily follow from more evident truths that he established earlier. But philosophers really worry a lot about whether these principles of identities are true. I mean, couldn't two nails that are like mass-produced by a machine be identical in all respects? I mean, where they're exactly the same. They're made of the exact same material, they're the exact same weight, the exact same size, the exact same, everything's exactly the same about them, except, one is here and one is there. Couldn't that be the case? And if you've had metaphysics, you know that we argue about this for a few weeks, because this leads to some bigger things. The reading we had in there brought up this question. Could there be a universe that is where all that exists in the universe are two iron spheres, and that's it? If you could create a universe like that, wouldn't that mean Leibniz was wrong? And this has deeper, actually, problems depending on other things you might be committed to in philosophy. If you think everything you know about, if you think all there is to reality is what you can perceive about it, then you have to be like Leibniz, because then it would be impossible if everything that you can know about reality just comes from what you can see, what you can feel, what you can touch, what you can observe about it. Then you have to be committed to the idea if two things are different things, then there's got to be an observable difference in those two things. So very quickly, some of these things that Leibniz has committed that seem kind of weird actually are things that have some really interesting ramifications depending on what you think about the world. Leibniz is committed to this because of the principle of sufficient reason. Other people are committed to this principle because they believe everything that is real about the world, everything that exists, must be observable. You can, of course, you can be done with Leibniz's principle if you just think there's more to reality than what is observable, and also if you think, principle of sufficient reason doesn't apply here, or principle of sufficient reason is false. Here's another real interesting thing that he says here on 266. Look on the right column, and look at the second full paragraph there. He says the complete or perfect notion of a substance, or of an individual substance, contains all of its predicates, past, present, and future. For it is certainly true that a future predicate will be, and so it is contained in the notion of a thing. And thus everything that will happen to Peter or Judas, both necessary and free, is contained in the perfect individual notion of Peter or Judas, considered in the realm of possibility by withdrawing the mind from the divine decree for creating him, and is seen there by God. And from this it is obvious that God chose from an infinite number of possible individuals those he thought most in accord with the supreme and hidden ends of his wisdom. Alright, maybe I should stop here. Free will stuff does follow pretty quickly from this. What is he saying? So let's just start first. What did he say is in the perfect notion of an individual substance? What did he say? Yeah.
Past, present, and future.
Everything about its past, present, and future. So, let me start with a simple kind of thing. We could talk about, here's a substance, my pen. We could talk about what is my pen presently contains within it right now, everything that is true about it, like, that it's blue, it has blue ink, what it's made out of, that it's starting to fade across here. But that's not a perfect conception of this pen. That is just a fragmentary conception of this pen. The perfect conception of this pen wouldn't just tell me about what it's like now. It would also include what it was like in its complete past. How was it yesterday? How was it the day before? And so on. And it will also tell me about its complete future. What will happen to it? Will I start chewing on it? Will, when will it run out of ink? Will it get lost? All those exciting questions in the life of a pen. Now, it's one thing to do that with pens, but he's talking about Peter and Judas. Famously, what is Judas famous for?
Betraying Jesus.
Betraying Christ, and by most accounts, committing suicide and spending eternity in hell. And Peter, did he deny Christ?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What happened to him? Why did Peter not go hang himself and die?
Was he martyred?
He did. He most likely was martyred, yeah. So, what was the difference in the two?
Mostly Peter asked for forgiveness from God, exactly.
That's right. Peter wanted forgiveness and received it. Now, here's what Leibniz is saying. The perfect and complete notion of Judas contains within Judas's nature all of Judas's past, all of his present, all of his future. That God, when He created Judas, created him that way. And when God created Peter, He created him also with His complete past, present, and future in him. And when God created you, God created you as a complete notion, completed with everything about you. So, the perfect or complete notion of a substance is that which contains all of its predicates, past, present, and future. And a substance, therefore, must contain all of its predicates, otherwise it would be a different substance. This is in part what differentiates Peter from Judas. They contain within themselves different things. So, one of the things I stopped with here is that God, when He decrees to create the world, decides to create the world from an infinite number of possible individuals, those He thought most in accord with the supreme and hidden ends of His wisdom. This is setting up the idea that when Leibniz believes when God created the world, that He created it with each substance kind of working in harmony with one another. A kind of harmony that he believes makes this world, we're going to get to this later, not just a good world, but the best conceivable of all possible worlds you can imagine. Now, the thing that bothers us for the moment is that this seems to conflict with free will. If God created Judas such that he has to betray Christ and go hang himself afterwards, how can Judas be free? If that's contained in his nature and his essence, if that's part of who he is as an individual, how can he do otherwise? We're not going to answer that one today. We're going to get to this. Keeps coming up in Leibniz. This is something that is a recurring theme. In this first reading, I just want to touch on a few things. The next thing that is of interest to us is what he says on 267 about these individual substances. That all individual created substances are different expressions of the same universe. Like I said, this stuff would be insane if it weren't for this guy being a known genius. What is he saying here? He wants to say that every substance is like a representation of the entire universe from its perspective. Now, it's not a complete and perfect representation or expression of the universe, but that each little substance that exists out there, each little thing, is in its own way a complete reflection and expression of the entire universe. Which also means if you were to change one thing in the universe, you would have to change everything in the universe. Because changing one thing means that everything else that is a reflection or expression of that one little bit would have to be changed. So if I wanted to wear, instead of a brown jacket, if I wanted to wear a black jacket today, it's not as simple as just saying, well, I can just trade out the jackets and everything else is the same. We'd have to change everything. Because everything in the universe, in some kind of way, reflects this reality. I know, this is weird. Here's another thing he wants to say here, that no created substance exerts a metaphysical action or influx on any other thing. He's saying there's no causal interaction between anything. So with Descartes, maybe we have the problem of how do minds interact with bodies, but we're fine with bodies interacting with bodies and minds interacting with minds. But wait. Leibniz is going to tell us that no two things can actually interact with each other at all. What he puts forward is the idea that what he calls mind-body concomitance, or concomitance, which is the idea that mind and body are two things that are perfectly synchronized with one another. That God, so he agrees with Elizabeth's critique of Descartes. Once you conceive mind and body as separate things, how do they interact? They can't. But he doesn't like what the occasionalists did either, where they say, well, here's how you make it work. God steps in every single time and performs a miracle. He calls that a deus ex machina. It's like a nice way of saying like God has to cheat every time to make the universe work. Instead, Leibniz said, you know what, I came to realize that the way to fix this problem is to say mind and body don't really interact, but God set things up such that when things happen in your mind, they are timed just right with things that happen in your body and vice versa. So that when you say, all right, arm, go up, and your arm goes up, it's not that your mind actually causally interacted with your body in making your arm rise. It was that your mind was perfectly timed with your body. So that after you say arm, go up, it happens. But that was like a pre-timed event. And vice versa. If I stub my toe on the desk and I feel pain in my mind, it's not that the sensation that something happened within the body that caused my mind to do that. It's that the event was perfectly timed with the event in my mind. And he thinks that this is the way it should work because of God. He really wants to create a perfect universe. He would create a universe that has this kind of pre-established harmony to it.
Maybe you already said it, but if they're just timed like properly, then what actually made your arm go up?
He believes, we're going to say more about this, but that the only thing that really can cause things to happen comes from within. Everything is sort of self-driven.
Okay.
There's more to this, don't worry. Just to make this more fun, he also doesn't believe in what he calls in this reading atoms.
Oh, yeah, hear this one.
And in the next reading, material atoms, and that's what he means here. He doesn't. This is a nice way of saying he doesn't believe, at least in a very real, strong notion of matter. Roughly, here's the argument. And remember, he invented calculus, which allows you to perform functions that go into infinity. For any amount of extension, this is the anti-Cartesian bit here, you can cut that thing in half. And for that thing, you can cut it in half, and that thing you can cut in half. How many times can you cut an extended thing in half? An infinite number of times. There's no limit. Well, he says people who believed in atoms, and this was sort of a big movement in this time, they believe there's some smallest physical particle in the universe. They just call that an atom. And that's what everything else is made up out of. And he says in the other piece that he was once attracted to this view, but then he realized this, that for as small as that is, you could always, in principle, imagine taking an atom and cutting it in half. And now it would have parts. So I guess an atom isn't the most fundamental basic thing. And those two parts that we can cut those in half. We cut those in half. He came to the conclusion that whatever is most fundamental about reality cannot be matter, cannot be extended. Because if it was, then we could always cut it in half and take out those parts from it. Whatever is most fundamental has no parts. It's the thing that you put together to create stuff that has parts. So everything can be subdivided. So since every material thing can be subdivided, the most fundamental thing there is to reality must not be a material thing. So instead of atoms, he takes us to these other things. And look on the very last page of this reading, 268, right-hand column. This is how he describes them. The very top. Something lacking extension is required for the substance of bodies. Otherwise, there would be no source for the reality of phenomena or for true unity. There is always a plurality of bodies and never one, and therefore in reality there is not even a plurality. Courtemoy, remember that guy who was an occasionalist, he proved atoms using a similar argument. But since atoms are excluded, what remains is something lacking extension, analogous to the soul, which they once called form or species. These true unities, these real basic fundamental elements of reality, are not extended things. And in here he calls them even souls, and in the next reading the same. I mean, one way to put this is, what is reality made up out of? Souls. He thinks everything is the most basic unit is a soul. Now, what does that mean? We still have to figure that out. But that's the idea that's going to continue to be developed in the next couple of readings. Is there anything in primary truths that you'd like to revisit before I just keep pressing along here?
Yeah, I had a question about the identity thing, which you know two things to be separate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, just a hypothetical. So actually, a real question. Let's say I had two computers, right? And they both had the same exact program. Can't you say those programs are the same?
He does talk about in other writings that in abstraction, some things can be similar, like perfectly similar. So that you can imagine a circle being just like another circle. The question would then become, what do you think a program is? Is a program a thing or not?
All right.
If a program is a thing, then he would say there's got to be some difference, some infinitesimal difference between the two that maybe we can't even know. But there's got to be a difference.
Okay.
If a program is just a formal abstract entity, he might be okay with them being identical because they're not things.
Okay.
So isn't that a grand way to answer your question? Other ideas with this? Leibniz, I don't know how to say this enough. The only reason why we take this seriously is because Leibniz was an unequivocal genius.
We're saying if two things are manufactured, let's say like the exact same point in time, and they're exactly identical in every shape, weight, size, whatever, all that stuff, they're different because they're in two different places?
He would say there's more than that to it even. And there's got to be some other difference between the two. Even if, and he says this in other writings, that maybe we don't see the difference, but there's got to be one.
In the way that molecules can be structured within a thing like
How much like
something, right?
organic chemistry
Yeah.
we learn about all protons and electrons?
Yeah, so
Everything's different, but it might be the same, like a resonance structure, which is like the same thing, but the electrons are moved in
Right.
different ways, but they chemically balance each other out, I guess.
yeah, I mean,
But it's different.
with the atomic world, it gets harder and easier. It gets easier with big objects because, strictly speaking, do you think the exact same number of electrons are in this table as in that one? And the same thing goes. I mean, like even on mass-produced lines, we're going to probably have difference of those elements. I mean, of those parts at the atomic level. But this is where it gets harder. He's going to say every electron is different from one another. And every proton, and every neutron, and every quark. I mean, that's where, scientists are puzzled because, as far as we can tell, they're all the same.
Could you be wrong?
Could Leibniz be wrong?
Yeah.
He might be. Modern science, I think, hopes so. But if he's right, this whole argument about you could always divide things in half, if there is something to that, then we have to he's going to say, he's not going to say that science is wrong, as much as he's going to say we just have to rethink the way we think about the world. Let's move on and see a little bit more. I'm going to get through as much as I can of this, maybe in about 10 minutes here. So this is 1695. We move close to a decade or so after the last reading. This one, so the first reading, I don't think that he published in his lifetime. I think these are just some of his writings he had. So this one he was asked to publish this because people are finding out about his philosophy and they're trying to make sense of it. They say, can you tell us about your view? So in this one, he calls these things that we've been trying to get at true unities now. That's how he likes to refer to them. Building on the last argument that we went over, he says these things are not material things because you cannot divide them. They're supposed to be the most basic building blocks of reality. So they have no parts and they can't be broken up. Since all material things with extension you can always in principle cut in half, it must be the case then that these true unities are not material atoms. He calls them souls. He refers to them as primitive forces that are a source of activity. In other words, he thinks of them as intrinsically being moved, intrinsically as containing within themselves motion, as opposed to being acted upon, like being passive. So these are things that are truly active entities. They're not passive entities. So everything in reality is a soul, or is composed of souls or minds. The desk, the chair, the book, your glasses, your pen, a bunch of souls. But, look on the bottom right of 270. He says, I judge, however, that we must not indiscriminately confuse minds or rational souls with other forms or souls, for they are of a higher order and have incomparably greater perfection than the forms thrust into matter, which in my view are found everywhere. Minds being like little gods in comparison with them, made in the image of God, and having in them some ray of the light of divinity. So he's saying, just because I'm calling these things souls, don't think that everything has a soul like you and I have a soul. There's a difference between the souls that make up material objects and things, and the rational minds that are found in people like you and I. More on that as we continue to understand what the heck he's doing. Let me skip reading the passage here and let's jump to the punchline. So, he wants us, we know that he wants to reject the existence of material atoms. This is partly because of the issue of subdividing. But there's another reason that is at stake here, which is that he doesn't see how we could transfer one thing from one substance to another. If these true unities or these atoms of substance are really basic, like the simplest kinds of things you can get, then you can't pass something from one into the other. So you can't transfer energy or motion or force from one to another, because that would mean like this one had force and it as a part of it, and it transferred it and gave it to this other one. Well, if you can give and receive something like that, then you're not basic. So he wants to say that these atoms of substance, or these metaphysical points, these true unities, they don't interact with one another. They can't exchange things with one another. They don't. They're not composed of anything. Let me see what else I want to bring out from this. These metaphysical points, or these atoms of substance, he said, are the real things of the universe. And so this leads you, well, then what is everything? What is the book? What is the desk? What is my glasses? What are these things? Once again, I'm going to not read this, but just say, this is what he thinks of these true unities, these souls. Every single one of them, if you remember from the last reading, contains its past, present, and future all within itself. What happens is over time, all that happens is the thing just does, what he describes as unfolding. That it already contains within itself its future. So what's happening is that it's just doing what it's supposed to do. It's just happening. It's making itself do what it's supposed to do. It's driving itself to its own end. And everything is like this. And so one of the questions that came up earlier was like, well, how does causation happen, or how do things happen in the world? They all happen as a result of these internal forces driving them to do their own thing. He also says that our internal sensations are true appearances and like well-ordered dreams. This is where we come back to the question, what do you say about tables and chairs and books and everything, all the other material stuff in the world? He says that the representational content we receive about the world is not caused by external things, but it is generated from the internal constitution of the being that has it, you and I. So part of your internal essence, your complete notion, is that you would have the experiences you're having now. But you're not caused to have these experiences by me or by anything else in the world. It's just part of your internal nature. And as that unfolds, you have these experiences. And everything is like that. If you're in a conversation with somebody, according to Leibniz, you don't actually interact with one another. What's happening is a perfectly timed event where they say something, and then from their own nature, within their own essence, comes the reply that you say. And here's the catch, is that you actually hear, what you hear from them is part of your own internal nature, and then when you speak, they're not hearing your voice, they're hearing what they were pre-programmed to have unfold and happen.
So everybody, you kind of say people interpret things subconsciously the way they understand it.
In a way, everybody just has is sort of in their own isolated experience. Nobody has shared experience.
Yeah.
So it's like we're computers, or like machines.
He would want to say, he wouldn't like that, but he would want to say that there's something beautiful about this. Like in the Olympics, when those ice dancers did their little twizzles, you know, and they're like in perfect synchronization with one another. They weren't, what we like is how that synchronization was like beautiful and harmonious. They're not actually interacting with one another. It's just a perfectly timed spin that makes that look beautiful. Well, Leibniz thinks the whole universe is kind of like that, where nothing actually is causing anything else to happen. It's just timed just right so that it appears to be that way. All right, I'm going to have to stop here. We've got a little bit more of the new system of nature to do, but I think we're going to be able to get caught up and on time for next week. One other thing. On Moodle, I have a series of questions I want you to answer for the first half of the monadology. I've got 10 questions listed, and I tell you to pick your favorite 7 to answer. Bring those with you when we have class again. Either way.
Okay.
Go ahead and get started. At the end of last class, I was trying to rush through this reading of the new system of nature. And we are just kind of getting some of the basics of what Leibniz philosophy includes. We already went over this, but I thought it'd be kind of good to start with this question to reorient us into thinking about Leibniz. Leibniz does not believe that there are at least what we would call material atoms. Does anybody remember one of the reasons that he gives for rejecting the existence of material atoms? Yeah.
That they can't be divided, so therefore they don't exist.
Yeah, or more precisely, that's right, that since matter can always be divided, if it has some kind of extension to it, then the most fundamental kind of thing must have no extension, and therefore not be material. So if atoms can be... So material things can always be divided in some way. No matter how big it is, you can always say what's half of that, right? So Leibniz said whatever is the most fundamental constituent of the universe, the most basic kind of thing that exists, that has no simpler parts, would have to have no extension to it. It would have to be immaterial. And so that's what he calls in the system of nature these atoms of substance or metaphysical points. And as you read for this week, the name he ultimately gives these things is monads. So we'll talk about that Speaking of which, if you have homework to turn in, pull that out and pass it to the middle. I'll pick those up in a second. So, the first thing to kind of realize for Leibniz's philosophy is that he rejects the existence of atoms or material things as being a basic part of the universe. Leibniz is often referred to as an idealist, which doesn't mean like, a dreamer or somebody who wants world peace or something, but an idealist in the sense that the most basic part of reality is not matter, but thought or immateriality. We're going to read about another idealist later in this course named Berkeley. But for now, let's think about Leibniz as an idealist. So one of the things he believes is that the universe doesn't have these material atoms to it. He thinks that the universe is made up of immaterial atoms. We talked about how everything, the complete concept or the complete notion of a concept would be one that contains its past, its present, and its future. And so he thinks that you are one of these substances, one of these atoms of substance. And so you contain within yourself your complete history. That what you are as you is not just what you are right now, it's what you were and what you will be. And if you change any of those things, it's no longer you we're talking about. We're talking about something else altogether. So in the class, I did not read this, but I kind of went over it real quick at the end. Let's go ahead and read this. If you have your book, open it up to page 273. I'm going to look at the right-hand column. Oh, sorry, the left column. So he says, this is that top paragraph on the left. He says, I must admit that they have penetrated the difficulty by articulating what could not possibly be the case. But their explanation of what actually happens does not appear to eliminate the difficulty. The they there is this group of people called occasionalists. We talked about the occasionalists real briefly. Anybody remember what do occasionalists think about causation? We didn't read about it, and I kind of filled it in when we were at the very end of our discussion of Elizabeth's correspondence. Yeah.
I think I'm wrong, but is it those people that believe that God makes all our actions for us?
That's pretty much it.
Right.
That God alone is the only cause in the universe. So the occasionalists thought, when dealing with this problem of how do mind and body interact, is they said, well, they don't literally interact with one another. What happens is when your mind says arm go up, God jumps in and causes your arm to go up. And when you stub your toe on a rock, it's not that the nerves in your brain cause you to feel pain, because brain and mind cannot interact. It's that God jumps in there and every single time causes your mind to have the sensation of pain. So the occasionalists fix the mind-body problem, so to speak, by having God perform a miracle every single time mind and body interact. So this is what he's talking about here. He said those guys, they penetrated the difficulty by articulating what could not possibly be the case. And their explanation of what actually happens does not appear to eliminate the problem. Okay. It is quite true that speaking with metaphysical rigor, there is no real influence of one created substance on another, and that all things, with all their reality, are continually produced by the power of God. But in solving problems, it is not sufficient to make use of the general cause and to invoke what is called a deus ex machina, or when one does that without giving any other explanation derived from the order of secondary causes, it is, properly speaking, having recourse to a miracle. In philosophy, we must try to give reasons by showing how things are brought about by divine wisdom, but in conformity with the notion of the subject in question. So he's criticizing these occasionalists because they're trying to fix this problem by basically having God step in every time and do a miracle. Well, miracles are nice if you need to have a miracle every now and then to explain the universe. But if you need to have a miracle take place pretty much constantly in the universe to explain it, then you really don't have a good theory here.
Why are they called occasionalists if it happens all the time?
Well, they saw it as what we do, we don't cause things, we create occasions for God to cause things.
All right.
So it's think of occasion more like a prompting, not as in sense of like occasionally, but in the sense of like this is the occasion in which God jumps in and does that.
That's why I was confused about it.
Yeah. I didn't make the name. Once you name something in philosophy, it's over. So somebody else named it, and now we're stuck with it. It's like whoever named, well, these are philosophy jokes that only I would get. Okay. Now, let's keep reading in the next paragraph and look for this phrase where he says, our internal sensations are true appearances and like well-ordered dreams. And I want to talk about this. This is related to the next issue, which is about how is it that if everything's immaterial, the most basic things are immaterial, what are desks and chairs and tables and everything else? So he says, therefore, since I was forced to agree that it is not possible for the soul or any other true substance to receive something from without, except by divine omnipotence, I was led little by little to a view that surprised me, but which seems inevitable, and which in fact has very great advantages and rather considerable beauty. That is, we must say that God originally created the soul, and any other real entity, in such a way that everything must arise for it from its own depths, through a perfect spontaneity relative to itself, and yet with a perfect conformity relative to external things. And thus, since our internal sensations, meaning those in the soul itself and not those in the brain or in any other subtle parts of the body, are merely phenomena which follow upon external beings, or better, they are true appearances and like well-ordered dreams, those internal perceptions in the soul itself must arise because of its own original constitution. That is, they must arise through the representative nature capable of expressing external things as they relate to its organs, given to the soul from its creation, which constitute its individual character. So this is we'll get to this part of the quote in a moment. What he's saying here is that every substance that we've been talking about, every simple organism, every simple thing, the complete concept of it contains its past, its present, and its future. And what happens then with mind and body is not that the two interact with one another. It's not that he doesn't think there is a way to explain how mind can interact with body and vice versa. But what he does say could be done, and I should say one other thing, he doesn't think that God is going to perform a miracle every time we need that interaction. That's just too sloppy and inelegant. God would do better than that. So how do we fix the problem? We set it so that mind and body don't causally interact with one another, but they are perfectly timed in synchronization, such that they don't interact, but they behave just like they do. So God has created your mind such that it has events go on in it that are perfectly synced up with what happens in the body. And likewise, because of the way he's committed to understanding these simple substances, they don't causally interact with one another. So how is it that you're able to experience the world? How do you experience a chair if a chair can't causally interact with your eyes? Well, he says it's the same kind of thing, that your soul, or your mind, is so perfectly set up by God such that when your body moves to where you should see a chair, it is timed such that you experience, ding, a chair right then. I may have used this last time where if you're having a conversation with somebody it's not that you can causally interact with them, like with the sound waves of their voice, or they can't hear your voice, that you don't actually interact with one another. What is it? You're perfectly timed, such that your soul sort of unlocks as time progresses that experience of perceiving voices when you should hear them, and then the other person at just the right time perceives your voice. But not because of they actually interact with one another, it's contained within yourself. So, when you experience the world, and you see tables and chairs and everything else, he says that is like, those internal sensations are true appearances and like well-ordered dreams. Why does he say that? What would be maybe a badly ordered dream? Like, what happens in a confusing and bizarre dream? Yeah.
Unrelated events?
Yeah, I mean, crazy stuff happens, right? You are 1 minute in the classroom, you turn around, and the next minute you're outside, and then a dragon is chasing you, and then you've got a little puppy dog or something, right? Things just don't make any sense. But in a well-ordered dream, things fit together in a coherent way. Our experience of the world, he says, is not really of the world. It's just our own internal experience. So in a way, it's like, but not exactly like, our entire lives are dreams. That God has pre-established, before you ever came into existence, your nature such that when you come into existence, you would have this synchronization, this synchronized experience of the world. But since you don't actually interact with the world, all it is just like a well-ordered dream. It comes from within yourself. It doesn't come from the outside. Now, he says these are true appearances. So he's not a skeptic. He's not trying to say, don't believe there is a world. He's saying that these appearances, while they come from the inside, they're not generated from the outside world, it still is the case that there's a truth about them, that God has thankfully arranged things such that what happens does tell us about the way things are. We're going to have a lot more to say about this idea with the rest of his philosophy. So, representational content, visual, auditory, tactile, taste, olfactory, all those kinds of experiences we have, they're not caused by external things, but they are generated from the internal constitution of the being that has it. By that I mean it's generated by your own self. All this stuff is inside of you, and just it becomes sort of unlocked. It unfolds just with time. So all of your experiences and all the things that you have in your mind are sort of pre-timed events. God creates every single individual containing within itself its own representation of the entire universe. Now he says he emphasizes this is an entire representation of the universe, but just from your perspective. But in this way, everything in the universe is interconnected on his view. You can't think on Leibniz's view, what would I be like if if I was 5 feet taller? Leibniz says that wouldn't be you anymore. Because if you change that, you'd have to change everything else in the universe. Because if you were 5 feet taller, then that would change what everybody else thought about you. It would change the clothes that you bought. And if those clothes were bought, then somebody else couldn't buy them. And so you'd have to change that about them. And if maybe somebody, if they didn't buy that piece of clothing, they wouldn't meet their spouse. And if that, you'd change everything in the universe. And as a result, we're not even talking about the same universe anymore. So Leibniz says you are essentially everything you do. And you change one little thing about you, and it's a different you altogether. It's a different world. We can't even fathom what that would be like. Yeah?
What about people who lose a lot of weight? Are they totally different then?
For Leibniz, he would say that was part of their nature to lose the weight. So it was, change is possible, but all the change has to come from within. So the way that things work like that is that essentially what was part of that person's essence was that they would eventually come on to lose that weight. Yeah.
Is there any way to break that mold, or is it just like if you made a drastic life change, like
he would say no.
That's already like premeditated.
That's part of who you are as well. So we're gonna. I mean, one of the concerns that comes up with this is free will and destiny and some of these kinds of interesting concepts. Leibniz doesn't think he has this problem, but certainly a lot of people are very concerned about that. So if nothing interacts with one another, if everything is generated just from within oneself, I mean, how does this work practically speaking? Well, God created each and every substance such that everything is in perfect agreement with one another. It's sort of like if you had a bunch of wind-up toys that move and dance around. If you could set those toys up such that they all look like they would participate in some team sport, they don't actually participate together. It's just all from their own internal workings that it looks like they have some cooperative thing going on. If you could get a bunch of wind-up toys that look like they're dancing together, doing some kind of square dance or something like that, that would be really cool looking. But it wouldn't be right to say that the toys interact with one another or respond to one another. It's just from within their own nature that they're able to have this configuration that looks like a dance. In the same way, God has set up every single monad, every one of these immaterial substances in the universe such that they all have their own internal nature, and as time unfolds, they're able to create this nice harmonious universe. Something that would never happen on its own, but with God's providence, of course, you could arrange that.
So basically two countries at war with one another, Leibniz would say the one country was meant to go to war with the other country, kill those people. That was part of their internal nature to die at this point in time.
That's right. Everything, yeah.
But then that's not really a harmonious agreement because there's no harmony in war. So
hold on to that from the monadology, because he's going to argue to everyone's amazement that this world is the best of all possible worlds, and that God should create this world for that reason. Yeah.
So back to the toy example, we're all kind of in his view, we're all kind of robot toys that can perceive us dancing.
That's right.
All right.
That's right. We're all these. Your nature contains within it everything that makes you do all the things that you do, perceive the things you perceive, and the universe is just all of these parts put together in a way that there's this harmony and balance and unity. Let's get to this, because this is the ultimate question. We start going here. Everyone starts thinking about what about my free will? Look at the first full paragraph here on 274. So when he's talking about this view, he calls this view the pre-established harmony of the universe. So he's talking about pre-established harmony. He says, it also has this great advantage, that instead of saying that we are free only in appearance and in a way sufficient for practical purposes, as several intelligent persons have believed, we should rather say we are determined only in appearance, and that in rigorously metaphysical language we have perfect independence relative to the influence of every other creature. This also throws a marvelous light on immortality of our soul, and the always uniform conservation of our individual being, which is perfectly well regulated by its own nature and protected from all external accidents. Let me stop there. He thinks that this model gives you more freedom than any other model. Why? Because on his view, nothing can stop you from doing what you want to do. That there is no outside force that can prevent you, besides God, but God doesn't do that here. But there's nothing that could stop you from following your nature. So because there's no outside cause that is keeping you or stopping you or causing you to do what you do. Everything you do comes from your own nature, comes from within. You're okay. So he thinks that we are determined only in appearance, which is the sense in which you say, but wait, I couldn't act any differently than I do. But he says that's really not an important aspect of our freedom. You really don't, this is my own way of reading it now, you don't want to have the ability to do anything else than what you do. If you see a child drowning in like a shallow pool of mud, and you can save that child's life, you go and save the child's life, and you really don't value the thought that, man, I really wish I could do something different here. You actually want, I think, to be such that when you see that, it better be the only thing you choose to do. So, think about, the way he's wanting you to think about this is, you are free to do what you are supposed to be. You are free to fulfill your nature, to let your essence of who you are unfold in an unfettered and undisturbed way. No outside force can stop that. And that is what makes you free. So, no other substance, nothing on the outside can causally affect any other substance. So each individual is free insofar as it is able to act according to its internal essence perfectly without any outside influences. And that's the sense in which he says we're free. And more free than anyone else says, because on all the other philosophies out there, you can have one substance causing another substance, which means one thing can stop you from being free. Whereas on his view, nothing stops you. It's all the things that happen to you are caused by yourself. So, what do y'all think about this? Do you think that does this sound a little more plausible as an account of free will, or do you still have some reservations? Yeah, Sarah?
Well, it's saying, he said that God is God creates us to do like everything that he wants, but like we're supposedly fulfilling our nature. So whatever he chooses our nature to be, that's what we have to do, but kind of not like free will.
It's not free because you want to choose your own nature.
Yeah.
Similar concern comes up from Lady Masham. Talk about that too. Anybody think this makes this a little easier to swallow, or is it still unpalatable for most of you? Yeah, Alex?
I think it's interesting, but I don't think it's free will. I think it's kind of like acceptance of like determinism almost, but I don't know why he's insisting it's free will.
Other thoughts? That's good. Well, we're not done with this. I mean, like I said with Leibniz, we're going to kind of keep getting his philosophy. Yeah?
He says like you're free to fulfill your nature, but you have no other choice because you can't break the mold.
So there's two intuitions about free will that we want to resolve. One is, some of us have the idea to be free, you have to be able to act in other ways. Leibniz rejects that. To be free, he says, does not require that. But here's another sense in which we think freedom matters. Freedom matters insofar as you're free when you're able to do what you want to do, when you're able to follow what your nature and your character dictate you should do. He says you can do that. Yeah.
So wait, is whatever I'm doing, is that already predetermined?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's going to say, stop trying to act, you're not going to be able to act otherwise, but you are able to act in accordance with your nature. Yeah.
I feel like the nature comes after your actions or thoughts.
Think of nature not as like personality, or your character. Think of it more as like what you are as a thing. Like there's a nature to this desk. You know, the desk has a certain nature that you could argue was true of the desk before it existed. It's like the essence, the thought of what the desk is. Likewise to you, there is an essence to what you are as, Vincent. There is a Vincent nature that makes you unique from everything else in the universe. And that would include all the choices you make. if you made different choices, you wouldn't be Vincent. Therefore, that's part of his case for kind of saying you can't act otherwise you wouldn't be you. I don't know if that makes any sense. Yeah?
So it seems he has like an entirely different definition of free will.
Yeah. This works more like, if you've had me for intro, which I know you have. There are two ways to define free will. One is the libertarian view, which says free will means being able to act in alternative ways. There's another view called compatibilism, which says free will is consistent with being causally determined. He is a compatibilist. Contrary to what our little secondary source says by Kenny, this is one part of his book that I thought was flat out wrong. He calls Leibniz a libertarian, and I see no possible way that could be true. If you're interested in this, this would be one subject you could tackle in a paper. Leibniz on free will, there's a ton of things on it. So we're going to move on to the big book, the Monadology. This is actually, we have a piece of, this is handwritten stuff from it. It's pretty cool. And this is about, it's not quite 20 years, but it's close to 20 years after the reading that we just went over. And this is usually thought of, at least of the writings we have of him, the most systematic, the most complete explanation of his philosophical system, although it still is incomplete in a lot of ways. Let's go ahead and take a look at these first 6 sections. So it starts on page 275, and I've now marked everything off with just the section numbers for the Monadology because it's nicely organized this way. And as we read this, I'm going to ask you, which is essentially the first question on your homework, which is what is a monad? So let's talk about monads. He says, the monad, which we shall discuss here, is nothing but a simple substance that enters into composites. Simple, that is, without parts. And there must be simple substances since there are composites, for the composite is nothing other than a collection or aggregate of simples. And where there are no parts, neither extension nor shape nor divisibility is possible. These monads are the true atoms of nature, and in brief, the elements of things. There is also no dissolution to fear, and there is no conceivable way in which a simple substance can perish naturally. For the same reason, there is no conceivable way a simple substance can begin naturally, since it cannot be formed by composition. Thus one can say that monads can only begin or end all at once. That is, they can only begin by creation and end by annihilation, whereas composites begin or end through their parts. So, what are some of the things that we see about monads here?
They're the basis of all things.
They're the most basic things, and what is that? So, how does he define that? That's right.
There's no extensions.
So they can't have extension. Why? Because if they had extension, once again, you could break them up into parts. So if they're most basic, they have no parts.
I was just going to say that they were like the true atom, like he defines them as like the true atom.
That's right. So they're not material atoms. They're just like what we just read in the new system, where he's saying that these are, maybe formal atoms. They're immaterial atoms. So these monads are the most basic things in the universe. They don't have extension, so they don't have shape or figure. They can't be divided up in any way. What else do we know about them? Does he tell us about them? Yeah.
They can't begin or end naturally.
They can't begin or end naturally. And this is because they are simple things. So a composite can come into existence and go out of existence by being put together. I mean, take like a sandcastle. A sandcastle is made out of sand. The sandcastle can come into existence by putting the parts in the right shape, and go out of existence by kicking it over and removing all that structure. But you and I, we cannot create sand. The sand is already there. Of course, we could always, because sand is actually, the kind of thing we could break down atomically. It's not simple. But he's going to say if these monads are indivisible, they don't have any parts, you couldn't take them out of existence by like ripping them apart. In the same way, you can't bring them into existence by putting stuff together. They just have to be there. This is very similar, by the way, to an argument that Socrates gives for the existence of the soul and immortality of the soul. Socrates says the soul is a simple thing, it has no parts. So when you die, it can't be dissolved. Therefore, when you die, your soul continues to live on. So, monads are simple substances that have no parts. They are simples that must exist because there are composite things. Since there are composite objects, we're led to wonder what are its parts. And the most simplest kind of one would have to be one that has no extension, shape, or divisibility. And since they have no composite parts, they cannot naturally come into existence or go out of existence. Only God is capable of creating monads and destroying monads. One of the questions, I think the very next question I had is, what about the nature of change in monad? How is it that monads are capable of changing or not? Let's go ahead and look at section 7. He says, there is also no way of explaining how a monad can be altered or changed internally by some other creature. Since one cannot transpose anything in it, nor can one conceive of any internal motion that can be excited, directed, augmented, or diminished within it, as can be done with composites, where there can be change among parts. The monads have no windows through which something can enter or leave. Accidents cannot be detached, nor can they go about outside of substances as the sensible species of the scholastics once did. Thus neither substance nor accident can enter a monad from without. So what is he saying here about monads? One of the weird things is monads have no windows. What does that mean?
Like they have no parts or no like spaces that could be changed within it. It's just one single like solid object.
Yeah, so it's like one simple single unity
That can be combined with others, but that's it. Like it can't change itself.
Yeah, so since it has no parts within it, it's not like you could move the parts within it around, so it can't exchange things with other monads. It can't receive anything into it, and it can't send anything out of it. So, when this comes to change, what does this mean? It's impossible for there to be any change from the outside. Now, does that mean it's impossible for there to be change in the monad period? In sections 10 and 11, he takes us into this other idea. So let's take a look. 10 and 11 are really short. Let's go ahead and read those. It says, I also take for granted that every created being, and consequently the created monad as well, is subject to change. And even this change is continual in each thing. Well, we just said, how do you change? Nothing can go in or out of it. So how does it change? Section 11. It follows from what we have just said that the monad's natural changes come from an internal principle, since no external cause can influence it internally. So, these simple things are not capable of causally influencing one another. Yet they obviously do undergo change. Like, just look at your own life and your own experience. You are experiencing change all the time. So how is that possible? Not by any influence from the outside, but it comes from some internal principle. And this is related to what we've already been talking about, that you contain within yourself all of your own essence, everything about you, past, present, future. So that means that as time goes on, you experience change not because things from the outside change you, but because things from the inside move you. It's your own nature, it's your own essence, it's your own being to be this way, to have these experiences. So you change because of these internal principles from within you. It's from your own self that you undergo change. So far, so good. So, how is it that we then perceive the world? There's no windows inside the world, and there's no windows in or out. How is this possible? Well, he says, first of all, he says that every monad has perception to it. So every single monad, so there are monads like you and I that are rational creatures, but even monads have to make up my water bottle, and have to make up this clicker, and have to make up the table. Is he seriously saying that all of these things have perceptions? Yes. But he does want to say that perception is different from apperception. Apperception is the idea of self-awareness, like self-consciousness. So that there's a sense in which all these other things have a kind of perception, like the monads that would make up the desk or your book or this clicker. They have perceptions insofar as, we're going to see later too, that they are driven by what he calls appetite, or he calls them an entelechy. And what that means is that it's this internal principle idea that from within them they're moved. They desire almost to go places and do things and follow their nature. So apperception is different in that it's a kind of self-awareness that we have, that rational creatures have, but not all monads have that. In section 17, he gives us an interesting example about touring a mill. And this is supposed to be related to thinking about consciousness. This is kind of related to something I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. Let's take a look at this passage. He says, "We must confess that the perception and what depends on it is inexplicable in terms of mechanical reasons, that is, through shapes and motions. If we imagine that there is a machine whose structure makes it think, sense, and have perceptions, we could conceive it in large, keeping the same proportions, so that we could enter into it as one enters into a mill. Assuming that, inspecting its interior, we will only find parts that push one another, and we will never find anything to explain a perception. And so, we should seek perception in the simple substance and not in the composite or in the machine." So, what is he saying about perception? You think of perception as like consciousness. Why does he say that you couldn't find consciousness in a machine? I want you to think, some of you might be inclined to think your consciousness is just something that is caused by the brain. Yeah.
Well, couldn't it be as simple as just saying a machine couldn't possibly think or make conscious decisions? It's just programmed to do a certain thing, and it just does that certain task?
It's not what he's getting at. You could make that case, but that's not the case he's making. Yeah?
He's saying that there's no specific thing you could point to that would lead to a consciousness?
What you would find is all the events that go on in the machine. You never find the consciousness. Where's the consciousness? Suppose you think consciousness is nothing more than brain activity. Some of you might be inclined to that view. Well, Leibniz says, imagine we could just enlarge your brain by like 100 times. And then we could like tour your brain. We could give like walking tours. This is Jane's brain. Here's the hippocampus and so on. If Jane was thinking of, a pink hippopotamus, you could tour her brain. You could see all the parts. You could see the chemical reactions. You could see the synapses. You could see the neural networks. You could tour the whole brain and get a complete examination of it. Would you ever find a pink elephant in there? No. You would just find a bunch of events that are different from being a pink elephant. Well, what Leibniz is saying, I think, is something very similar to that, which is you can never get consciousness out of mechanistic events. One thing pushing another, one thing transferring energy to another, one thing, one thing having some sort of chemical reaction. All that would just be one thing happening to another thing, but where's the consciousness? The consciousness, no matter how many of those things you have put together, you're never going to get a consciousness out of it. So consciousness, he says, you'll never find it in those kinds of things. It's got to be something actually more basic, something simpler than the events themselves. It's almost backwards, he thinks, to be trying to find consciousness in these larger causings, these larger mechanistic events. It's actually, you have to explain the mechanistic events in his view in terms of consciousness. I think that's kind of neat. So, the next few things relate to what I was just talking about with appetites and what he calls entelechies. What he calls appetites is like this internal driving force, these things that move us to do the things we do. Now, for like you and I, as rational creatures, sometimes, we experience these as like literal appetites. Like we get hungry, so we go get food. You get thirsty, get a drink of water, and so on. But in simpler organisms, it's like saying of all these monads, they're being driven by their own internal desires, their own internal nature, to do all the things that they do. So he calls these entelechies. This is a word from Aristotle's metaphysics, which is sort of like an inborn end purpose. They're like purpose-driven beings. So they're driven not from the outside by external causes, but they're driven from within, that they just do what they do by their own nature. So he says that we can, if you like, we can call these things souls, these monads, because they have perceptions and appetites, which he thinks is sort of sufficient for something being a soul. But at the same time, they're not souls entirely like you and I. Just remember they don't have self-awareness, that they aren't rational creatures like you and I are. There are questions about this so far. Yeah?
Yeah, basically, if you move something, right? Like if I'm moving a banana, doesn't that mean I am like, well, at least my body is moving the monads? So and he's saying that the monads in the banana wanted to do that?
Yeah. Imagine, what if this was a perfectly timed event by God, such that when you think you're picking up the banana, those monads are actually voluntarily moving with you. So that you're not actually moving them as you think you are, they are moving themselves in just that perfect harmonious action to give the appearance of being moved.
But I'm talking about my hand mainly. Like,
right.
Not me thinking about, just the action of my hand moving. So my hand and the banana both wanted to do that.
That's right. That's one way to think about that. That everything in the universe is like that. It's driven within its own self to move in these ways.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, what would the energy force be within the monad if it has no parts?
He wants to say that that's just part of what it means to be a monad, is to be a self-driven thing. There's this idea, we're going to see this come up in Locke later, that spirits are like active things and matter is passive. So that like souls or minds are capable of like energetic action and matter is not. It needs to be moved. Well, he's kind of building on this same idea, saying that, well, monads as being like these basic souls are just sort of like pure activity in a way.
I think that you might have been kind of just saying this just now, but I'm trying to just get a hold on it.
Sure.
A monad wouldn't necessarily need any kind of energy source to move or anything like that, because it's, like you said, he's an occasionalist, so everything has been predetermined by God, so it just goes. It's not really like something's driving it or anything like that. It just kind of happens because that's the way it's been determined to happen.
That's right. The only small edit is I would not call him an occasionalist.
Right, but
everything else you said is great. That
okay.
It's almost like everything contains within itself its own energy source.
Right. Okay.
Let's go ahead and take a quick break here. I apologize if I sound like I'm repeating myself, but I think sometimes the best way with Leibniz is just to say it in as many different ways as I can, because it is kind of weird. And eventually something might stick. So let's take one of our quick breaks here from, let's try to be back when this clock says 6:32. Alright, let's pick up here where we left off. Are there any questions? Maybe I should just ask if there's any questions about anything we've just gone over, or anything else from the reading, really up through section, let's say about 20 or so. Yeah.
I guess it's just kind of confusing with the whole, like how you said, how in the beginning he was talking about how they're the most simple of things because there is nothing simpler, and then it went into, oh yeah, but they can be changed, and this, and I don't know, it was kind of...
One concern might be, how can they be simple, and yet it seems like actually they're pretty complex kind of things.
Right.
Simple in the sense that they can't be broken down or divided or taken apart.
Okay.
And once again, this is like you as what you are cannot be changed in any way. If you think, well, I could still be me if I didn't have, that dream last night. Leibniz is going to say no, because that would require breaking up something that can't be broken up. That's a part of who you are in a way that you can't divide that out or break it up.
Mm-hmm.
So are we monads? Like the Archimedes monads, basically?
There's,
made up.
Yeah. Your soul is one rational monad, and that's what you essentially are, according to Leibniz, is your soul. And your body is composed of an infinite number of monads. And that's not really who you are, but you have a body. And
so there's like one monad that takes principle over the rest of them when it comes to a human?
In a way, but once again, the two don't interact with one another.
Right.
Just such that your mind has these ideas like hand go up, and it's not that your mind causes the hand to go up, it's that it was a pre-timed event so that when you have the thought, that all these other monads do what they're supposed to do to raise the hand up. Yeah.
On perception, the whole, windmill thing.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can't that same reasoning be used for like other things? Like you could doubt like a computer program, for example. Let's say you have a computer program, right? You can't ever, if you look at like the hard drive, you can't ever find the program. You can only find parts of the program, the circuitry. So.
So how does this the argument might prove too much is one of the concerns, right? That if you can do this for consciousness in this way, well, we could do the same with a computer. You can take a tour of all the circuits, the hard drive. You're never going to find that picture of, the pink elephant that you've saved on the hard drive. So where is that? That might be a similar kind of concern here. I don't have much to say besides that's probably a fair criticism.
Right.
Yeah.
When it comes to like moving something or moving a part of your body, does that I feel like it completely cancels out like maybe like muscles or like motion. Like, so you're saying you don't use your muscles at all, or there's just bananas floating around connected to my hand?
In a way, yeah. I mean, it once again gives the appearance, of course, as if everything works the way that you thought it did before you read Leibniz. But in reality, things on his view couldn't be they can't causally influence one another. So God had to make it this way.
So if the banana's going to move and I decide not to move it, it doesn't move anyway.
The way that in principle, it could be the case.
That would be decided, though, that you decided not to move it.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. So
that's annoying.
If there wasn't a God behind all of this organizing it, it could have been the case that you decide not to move a banana, but the monads that make up the banana decide to move. But since God's ordered it so it doesn't do crazy things like that, that never happens. it's really important to keep in mind that Leibniz was a certifiable genius beyond any person you've ever met. We would not be taking this seriously if he did not write this and it wasn't obvious that he was a genius beyond comparison. Remember, the guy invented calculus. That's part of why we take the time to figure this stuff out, because clearly a genius had something in there, and if we're not getting it, the fault might be on our side, not on his, is what we tend to think. So, and there is a sense, when we get to the very end of this, there is something about this that actually isn't so crazy. I know it seems crazy at times, and I want to bring that out because it helps you understand the philosophy. You don't, if you're reading this and you say, "Oh, that's just common sense to me," you probably don't understand it. Like, this really is kind of weird, and it's important to get the weirdness of it first. But at the end of this, like I said, maybe it's not so weird if I can explain that when it's all said and done. Any other questions? Anything about the text? I know a lot of you spent a lot of time trying to understand this, so if you had questions, I want to make sure that I give you the opportunity to ask them or to address them. So, anything I can do to help you with that before moving along?
How exactly is his ontological argument different from the ones that we previously learned? And
so that's coming up next.
All right.
So we'll get to that.
Okay.
There's something I think a little different about this one. Some people, well, there's a lot of scholarship on this. You could write a paper on how his argument is different from Descartes and Anselm's, but we're getting to that. Before we do that, we need to talk about the two great principles. Anybody remember from your notes, or if you want to look in these sections, what the two great principles are? Yeah, go for it.
That of contradiction and that of sufficient reason.
So we've got the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of contradiction says that which involves a contradiction must be false. Basic principle of logic. It's also important to remember Leibniz was a logician, so he thinks logic can achieve a lot. The other principle is what he calls the principle of sufficient reason. That all true things have a sufficient reason for their being true. In other words, there's not randomness, there's nothing, something can't be true without a reason for why it's true. Now, he parallels these two principles with two different kinds of truth. He calls one class truths of reason, and the other class truths of fact. Truths of reason are what we call necessary truths. They're the kinds of things you can't even conceive their impossibility. You can't imagine them being false. Truths of fact are contingent, meaning they're not necessary. That you can imagine their falsehood, but the way you figure out what truths of reason is using the principle of contradiction. If you cannot imagine something happening, something being the case, then it must be true. So here's a necessary truth. Here's a truth of reason. All red things are colored things. There is no way that you could imagine something that being red and it not being colored. If it's red, it's got to be colored. All red things are colored things. So, since you know that things that involve contradictions must be false, and the only way that something could be red and not be colored is if it was a contradiction, it must be true then that all red things are colored things.
Will this kind of go back to the Descartes absolute truth with truths of reason, like things that you cannot perceive to be false?
Yeah, I think that this is very much in line with the kinds of things Descartes had in mind, clear and distinct ideas. Things that when you understand them in a certain way, you see that they have to be true. When it comes to truths of fact, though, things that you can imagine the opposite being false, the possibility of them being true, you have to figure that out using the principle of sufficient reason. So like today, I wore a blue sweater. But you could imagine that I wore, a yellow sweater or a pink sweater, or that I wore no sweater at all. So this is a contingent truth that I'm wearing a blue sweater. That truth requires some sufficient reason for why it's this way rather than some other way. And it might just be, in this case, something as simple as, I don't know, I prefer wearing a blue sweater as opposed to not to. But everything has a sufficient reason. Why is Marywood located in Scranton, Pennsylvania? It could have been located somewhere else. There's got to be some sufficient reason for why it's here rather than somewhere else. Why are you sitting in the chair you're sitting in as opposed to some other chair in this classroom? Well, there's got to be a sufficient reason for that. So, since these are the entirety of the different kinds of truths that could exist, the two principles neatly map onto this. So by using these two principles, essentially, Leibniz thinks we can know everything. Thinks everything that's knowable to us. Questions about this distinction or the principles themselves? So, both of these principles essentially can be used by Leibniz thinks to prove the existence of God. So first is the principle of sufficient reason. And here is roughly how the argument goes. You can look at those sections more closely if you'd like. The first claim is that the universe as a whole entity exists contingently. That means you can imagine that the universe does not exist, or that a different universe exists. There's nothing about our universe that indicates that it had to exist this way. For that reason, our universe is a contingent entity. But, as we saw, all contingent truths require some sufficient reason. Therefore, we have to conclude there must be a non-contingent explanation. Another way to put that, a necessary explanation for the existence of the universe that is outside, that is not the same as the universe itself. Well, what kinds of things are necessary and exist outside of the universe? There's only one kind of thing Leibniz thinks, and that would be God. So the universe must have, the fact that the universe as a whole is a contingent entity, and you have to have a sufficient reason for it, and you cannot come up with a reason that is within the universe itself, you have to infer, it has to be the case that there is a God. Otherwise, you would have a contingent truth with no explanation, no sufficient reason. This is usually thought of as one form of a cosmological argument for the existence of God. What do y'all think about that? Do you think that the universe... Do you think that do you think the universe is contingent, is one question I could ask you. And the second one would be, do you think the fact that it's contingent requires us to postulate a God? Or infer that there is one? What if the universe is eternal? I mean, it still would be contingent. But if it had no beginning, would you still need for there to be a God to create the universe? Yeah.
You might have explained this a while back. Just to be sure, what exactly does existing contingently?
So to exist contingently is just not to be necessary. The way he would put it is you could imagine the contrary being true. So the fact that our universe as a whole exists contingently is like saying you could imagine it's conceivable that the universe does not exist, or that some alternative universe exists instead of this one. Sarah?
Well, if it exists contingently, then we would have to conclude that there would be a God, because he could change it if he
And that's true. So you think you're all right with his reasoning here? Yeah.
On the contingency, because I think it wouldn't be. It would be because if you thought of a different universe, that would I can't word it correctly. Never mind.
We might get into something like this. I don't know exactly where you're going, but we might actually have something like this very soon to come up to talk about.
I can't word it correctly. Sorry.
All right, let's take a look at his other argument. This is the one based on the principle of contradiction. See this in sections 40 to 45. This is very similar. This would be the one that's closer to the ontological argument. This is a really interesting argument. He says there are truths about possibilities. That is, things that could exist but don't. Like, you could imagine that it possibly could have been the case that you had another sibling. So if you have brothers and sisters, you can imagine what happens if you had one more brother, one more sister. If you have no brothers and sisters, you can imagine what if your parents had another one, right? There are truths about what possibly could be the case. If your parents had another child, would it be a boy or a girl? Would they be fun or would they be annoying? Would they do sports or would they do chess club? Or would they be awesome and do both? You know, there are possibilities that could be true. But here's the thing. If there are truths about possibilities, then there must be a necessary being, one whose essence includes existence, in whom those possibilities are grounded. Therefore, there must be a necessary being who grounds truths about possibilities. Otherwise, you would have true beliefs, once again, without anything that makes them true. So when we ask questions like, what would have happened if my parents had another child? Would that child be male or female? There is an answer to that question, but what is it that provides the ground of the grounds for that being true or false? Or, you know, if you say it's a girl, what grounds the fact that that could be a girl? It's not anything that actually exists, so it has to be grounded in something else, something that gives it those truths. And that thing, Leibniz postulates, must be a necessary being, like God. Now, I think this argument is a lot more difficult to grasp. In fact, I think a lot of scholars, including myself, read this over many times and are trying their best to make heads or tails of what this argument is really doing. I've tried my best to portray this as, look, there are truths. These truths require something to ground them, so you have to have something that grounds them. I think you could argue against this in two ways. You could argue that there really are no truths about possibilities. Maybe if you say, you know, there is no truth of the matter. If my parents were to have a child, that it would be male or female, and say, which one's true? I'd say neither one. I mean, that's just nonsense. That doesn't really, we don't want to really say those are true claims or false claims. The other thing you could argue is that they do have truth values, but what gives them their truth values is something besides God. I think this is the part of the argument that I have the hardest time wrapping my head around, which is, so why is it the case that if there are those truths about possibilities, why does that have to be grounded in a necessary being? I think that if I could understand this claim, that would really help me understand. Like, that's what I'm missing about Leibniz, at least on this point.
I think I might be with you in the sense that it confuses me that there would need to be a necessary being instead of there could be truths about possibilities, but why does there need to be a being behind those truths?
There at least needs to be something that actually exists, I think is what he wants to say. So it can't just be a possible being, it needs to be an actual being. Now the question might be, well, why does the actual being have to be a necessary being? You could say because these possibilities are always true. So if it's possible that I could have had a brother, it's not just true now, it's true 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago. So, you know, that might be part of the motive. You need a necessary being to ground it so it's like always true. Let's move on, because this is some of the more interesting stuff. So now, Leibniz, yes?
I have another question.
Go for it.
Does Leibniz believe that, what did he believe, did he believe that anything that was possible, like everything was possible to know? Because it's kind of the sense that I got from that previous argument, that there wasn't any information out there that was not attainable or understandable by humans.
I think that he has a very high view of human knowledge. I don't know if he would want to say that we could know everything, but he certainly thinks we can know a lot for a reason. We may not have all the information to draw the right deductions, but we've got the right principles to do so.
Because when he talks about the possibilities, it's like he can say that, okay, well, if you take any possibility, and he kind of says that some being necessarily has to know the truth behind this. That seems like a very strong kind of leap to me, and I guess I just don't understand exactly how that plays.
That's, I think, almost exactly my very problem with it. I don't really get that move either. If I could help you on that, I would love to. So Leibniz describes this world as the best of all possible worlds. You could not make this world any better. And in fact, there could be no other world that is better than the one that we currently inhabit. So if you think that the world would be just a little bit better, if there was like, you know, a vase of flowers on this desk, Leibniz says that's impossible. Either there's no possible way there could actually be a vase of flowers on here, or by doing that it would actually make the world a worse place in some larger reasons.
So there's a reason for everything.
There has to be, because the principle of sufficient reason says everything must have a sufficient reason. And if God is the architect of this world, then everything that takes place in this world God has some reason for it being that way. So, there are, at least, it seems like there are an infinite number of worlds God could have created. Because there are worlds where there is one human being in it, a world with 2 human beings, a world with 3 human beings, a different world with 4, 5, 6. That's just human beings, right? We could do this forever. You know, a world with 1 planet, a world with 2 planets, a world with 3 planets. God could have made an infinite number of different worlds. Why did God create this one out of all the ones he could have made? Leibniz says God must have a sufficient reason for choosing to make the world this way rather than any of the infinite number of other ways that he could have done it. For that reason, Leibniz gets committed with the principle of sufficient reason now to saying that this world has to be the best. Because if this is not the best of all possible worlds, then either God was stupid or evil in choosing to make this world, because he just didn't realize he was making this world that wasn't the best, or he didn't want to make the best, that would be bad, or God is not all-powerful. Maybe he wanted to make the best of all possible worlds, he knew this was the best of all possible worlds, but he just didn't have the ability. But since God, of course, is omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly good in his moral nature, it follows that God must create the best of all possible worlds. God could not do anything else. If he did, he wouldn't be God. It would require him to have some deficiency in his character. Yeah?
So you kind of answered what I was getting at. It falls back on that same principle that Descartes fell back on, that, well, God is all perfect, so he must have made the most perfect thing. Because I don't see how any of the other argument, like, his reasoning could be like, I didn't want to make the best possible world for you people to live in. I wanted to give you flaws and like poisonous spiders and maybe and things that, you know, really serve no purpose to you. You know, seem to be perfect in any other way. That everything seems to fall back on that one principle that an omnipotent being has to be perfect, so you must make everything that is perfect.
That's right.
You got to really eat that one up to. Okay.
And how could a perfect being choose to do anything less than the best, right? Yeah.
I mean, maybe he made an infinite number of possibilities, and we just happen to be in this one.
So that's one thing, actually. There's a philosopher named Tim O'Connor who published a book with this idea recently, which I'm sure you've read and got that from. No. That O'Connor thinks that one thing people generally say is, first, it's incoherent to think there is a best world. Sort of like saying the tallest human being, the tallest possible human being. Is there a tallest possible human? No, because for any height you imagine, there's always somebody that could be just like a half-inch taller, right? So the very idea of there being the tallest possible being, or the tallest possible human, doesn't make sense. The best of all possible worlds, they would say, doesn't make sense either, because you could always make the world just a little better. And as long as you could always make the world just a little better, there is no best of them all. Well, this guy, O'Connor, says, well, that doesn't stop God from creating an infinite number of good worlds. So God doesn't create the bad worlds, but He creates all the infinite series of worlds that are, on balance, more good than evil. And so he would say you're not committed to saying God creates the best, but just that God creates all of the good worlds. So you're committed to an infinite number of worlds, but at least it gets you off the hook from saying this is the best one. Leibniz thinks that there has to be a singular best world, because if there was no singular best world, God he thinks wouldn't create anything. God would do nothing. And since we're here and we exist, and we have to believe that God created this world on His philosophy, and that God doesn't do things without good reason, you have to think this world is the best of all possible worlds. He wrote a whole book dedicated to this. It's called Theodicy, and he kind of references every now and then in this book as well. In this bigger work of Theodicy, he defends the idea that this world, the way he defends it is you can't prove that this world is not the best of all possible worlds. For all we know, this is the best of all possible worlds. So, you might be looking at our world and thinking, are you serious, dude? I mean, have you seen what happens in our world? How can you say this is the best of all possible worlds? Part of his answer to this is that this is a beautiful world, that it exhibits exquisite amount of attention to detail when it comes to how all the parts come together to create this harmonious and beautiful and elegant system. Not just in the sense of like when you see sunsets and you see a whale jumping in the ocean or something, you go, oh, that's gorgeous. It's more in the sense of like the beauty and the harmony of these monads. That once again, since nothing actually causally interacts with one another, I mean, you look at the world and all the parts and all these monads all doing their thing. I mean, just that is this beautiful picture, this harmonious whole. And that these monads, he says, every single one is unique. There are no two, so if you remember way back to the first reading, no two things in the universe are alike. Everything has its own unique nature, which means, given the infinite number of different things that make up this world also expresses all the different kinds of reality, all the different kinds of natures that could possibly be expressed. And so God, once again, has made this world, not just in the way that we look at good and evil, but just in the quality of this world as a created thing, that this is the best of all possible worlds. Sometimes the way to think about his approach to evil, I talk about this some in my intro to philosophy classes, which some of you have had, is that you should think about good and evil more in terms of like mosaic artwork. So in mosaic art, it's made up by creating like a big picture, a big work of art, out of fragmentary, broken, ugly pieces that otherwise you would just discard in the trash. Shards. Now, what makes mosaic art very interesting is that it takes these ugly, broken pieces that would otherwise be regarded as trash and arranges them in a way to create a bigger picture that is beautiful and elegant and amazing. Well, Leibniz says that's part of also what makes this world the best. That God could have created the world where everybody is perfect morally. Like, no evil is conducted, where we all get along perfectly, and nothing bad ever takes place. But he's kind of, my own way of putting it, any old God could do that. I mean, to create a world where goodness comes out of creatures whose nature is to always do good, come on. You know what a real God would do? A God who's up for a challenge to show his wisdom and ingenuity and cunning? He would create a world where good comes out of evil. He would create a world where the evil that is committed by the little creatures in there produces an overall good that outshines the evil. And that is what he thinks this world is. That this world, while there is evil in it, God uses evil to produce good. And it's the using of evil to produce good that makes it the best of all possible worlds as well. In a good novel, like in a good book, you want there to be these conflicts and problems that hopefully get resolved in a good way. You know what would be a really terrible book to write or to read? Would be one where all the characters just get along and are happy. I mean, a 500-page book where everybody just gets along and is happy is boring. It's bad literature. A really good book would be one where you have children forced against their will to fight to the death in an arena. And then one of those children from like the poorest district, rises up to be a champion and ultimately overthrows the oppressive government. Now that is a cool story. That's the kind of thing that's the kind of intuition, it's not the exact thing that he's thinking, but that's the kind of thing Leibniz is getting at here, is that this is the best world insofar as it's the kind of world that God is able to use evil to accomplish good ends. He could have used good things to accomplish good ends, but it's more interesting, it's more clever to use evil to do that. You might worry a little bit about God and God's free will at this point. This is what I thought you might be talking about. I don't know if it is. That if God has to create what is the best of all possible worlds, if he has to do what he has if he has to have a sufficient reason for why he creates things, then God couldn't have created a different world than this one, could he? On Leibniz's philosophy, God must create this world. Now here's where it gets even weirder. If God necessarily exists, and God must create this world, then guess what? Then you and this world couldn't be there's no other way things could be than having this world exist. So if God must exist, and he must create this world, then this world also, it follows, must exist. Any questions about this part of Leibniz's philosophy? Because we're going to keep moving on here from the best of all possible worlds. Then the next section or series of things we get into talk about his theory of pre-established harmony. Once again, this is sort of going over the ideas we've already covered in a way. So he says that the soul follows its own principles, driven to final causes through its appetite. The body operates according to physical laws. We call these efficient causes. And he says that bodies act as if there are no souls, and souls act as if there are no bodies. However, there's perfect harmony between these two realms. And we've touched on this already, that your body would still do what it does even if there wasn't a soul, and your soul would do whatever it does even if there was no body. It's just that God has arranged this universe such that your body and soul dance in harmony with one another without interacting. The very last part of the book, he introduces this idea of the city of God. And he describes God as the perfect architect and the perfect monarch. And with God being the perfect architect is supposed to illustrate his design of the universe, this harmony we've been talking about, the orderliness of the universe. And the other aspect of this is God's perfect justice, that the wicked are punished and the noble are rewarded, and this, of course, involves an afterlife. One of the things that is shocking is this thing that he says about God. God only is good in relation to the city of God. So that God, considered all by himself, is not good or bad. And this is another reason why he thinks God must create a world, because God needs to be, by his nature, he needs to be good. So in order to be good, God has to create something so that he can be good towards it. And once he does, if he doesn't do that, he's not a good being. A lot of people might really get worried about this, because it seems now there's this concern in theology that, do you really think that does God need us for anything? According to Leibniz, God, in some sense, does need us. If God doesn't create us, he can't be good. So he needs us in order for him to be good to us. Yeah?
But if he didn't create us, then he wouldn't have to be good for us.
He wouldn't, but you might worry. He would say that God being a perfect being, part of being perfect, you have to be good. So if he didn't create us, God couldn't be God. And the book ends, this isn't the very last line of the whole book, but this is in that last section. And this is a nice way, once again, to try to think about this world being the best of all possible worlds. He says, if we could understand the order of the universe well enough, we would find that it surpasses all the wishes of the wisest, and that it is impossible to make it better than it is. So he thinks that if we really knew everything there was to know about this universe, about the way the world is, we couldn't imagine it being any better. That God has optimized this world to the best any world could possibly be. And that our inability to see that is really more of our inability to understand all the workings of the universe. But if you could understand the universe in its entirety, you would agree God made this world the best it could possibly be. Have any of you all read a book in maybe in one of your other classes by Voltaire called Candide? Or heard of it? Candide lived about the same time as Leibniz, just a little later. Voltaire lived a little bit around the same time. In Candide, you can look it up and read it online if you like. There's a character in there named Dr. Pangloss. Pangloss sort of means like skipping over everything. Dr. Pangloss is constantly saying in this book, this is the best of all possible worlds. And what Voltaire has happening is like he ends up getting like mangled and dismembered and abused, and through the whole thing, Dr. Pangloss just keeps saying, well, this is the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire was very explicitly making fun of Leibniz's philosophy here. If Leibniz thought that if there is a God, then he'd have to create the best of all possible worlds. And since there is a God, this must be the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire thought, if there is a God, then this must be the best of all possible worlds. This is not the best of all possible worlds, so there must not be a God. So, this does give us an interesting thing to think about, which is, do you think God is required to create the best of all possible worlds? And secondly, do you think this world is it? And it seems like you've got to come to terms with, if you believe in God, you got to come to terms with those claims. Otherwise, I think Voltaire wins the day. When I look around, I don't see this as being the best of all possible worlds. In summary, so this is the big picture view of Leibniz. All that exists in the universe is composed of these monads, or immaterial souls, these true unities. We had a bunch of different names for these. Atoms of substance. No two things in the universe actually causally interact with one another, but they are driven by their internal principles to act. Our perception of the material world consists of these true appearances, of these sort of well-ordered dreams. He likens these to even like the reality of a rainbow. Rainbows aren't real, but there's a sense in which you can say they're real. Like, if, I tell my 2-year-old, look, there's a rainbow over there. I'm not lying to her. But there's another sense in which rainbows aren't out there. He believes the universe has this perfect harmony among the parts that allows for the appearance of causal interaction without any real interaction. And the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason, they enable us to know truths of reason and truths of facts, respectively. Any questions about what Leibniz is doing in this? And sometimes it's helpful to just be like, now, well, seriously, how would he explain this? Or what on earth does he have to say about that? Or does he really believe such and such is the case? This is a very strange philosophy in a lot of ways, and I don't mind people asking those questions.
Why does he feel that, it kind of almost seems like he's putting the existence of God on us. It seems like he has a very extremely high opinion of humanity, so much to the extent that this has to be the best of all possible worlds. There could be other worlds out there that God could have created that could be better. Why are we why is it, if it's not us, then it doesn't exist? Because we don't know about it?
Well, one of the things to think about, let me see if I can find. I'm not going to be able to find the passage. One of the things that he says is that there's sort of an infinite number of worlds as we look at each organized thing. So humans are an important and good part of the created world, but we're not really even necessarily the center of it or the most important part. So he thinks that it's almost like each thing it leads to an infinite number of other worlds. It's like y'all familiar with Horton Hears a Who? Mm-hmm. So in Horton Hears a Who, it's like there's this whole other world on a speck. Leibniz is almost suggesting at times that that's the way our world is. We are one world, and an infinite number of monads make up this water bottle, which might mean that there's a whole series of other worlds just in this water bottle. And we might just be also a world within another set of worlds or something like that as well. So it doesn't necessarily imply that we are the best, we are the most important thing in the world, just that we're part of this world that is the best as a whole system. We're one part in that.
Okay, I think I see what you mean. We're a part in the most important world, even though there's other worlds within this world.
Yeah.
That's what he says.
Yeah, you wouldn't call them other worlds. That was my
right. Yeah, but that kind of concept.
Yeah.
So when an action is done, did you say universes can be created, like split apart, or a world can be created? Like, is there a world where I pick up Zach's water bottle, and then there's a world where I don't?
When we talk about possible worlds, other possible worlds don't actually exist. Only the actual world exists.
There's still the truth.
There's a truth about another possible world, but that world doesn't actually exist. So God grounds the truth of these other worlds, but they don't have to exist like this world does. Let's get started with our last reading for today. This takes us to the little book. We'll be reading, her name is Damaris Cudworth, and then she married a lord, so she became Lady Masham. She was a contemporary of Leibniz and John Locke, who we'll be reading next. Those of you that have they're doing the presentation next week, there's a little bit of intertwining in her life and John Locke's life as well, which is interesting. Her father is Ralph Cudworth. Ralph Cudworth held the position of being master of Christ's College in Cambridge. I put up here that he is an important philosopher in the group known as the Cambridge Platonists. Calling him important is an understatement. He is arguably, prior to Locke, the most important British philosopher, period. He is a big deal. He has many leather-bound books that smell of mahogany. People know him. He is a very important individual. We don't know much about her education, but one thing that was definitely important was that she had access to her father's library. When you think about our access to books and information today, we forget that there was a time when it was really hard to get a hold of certain books and information. And the fact that her dad was the big dude at Cambridge was really helpful. So she had resources. We know that she learned French, and she was not taught Greek or Latin, but she learned Latin when she got older. In fact, I think she learned it from John Locke. We know that she learned French because the very correspondence that we have, that we read for this week, she wrote in English, and Leibniz wrote in French. And nobody translated them. So Leibniz could read English, we know, and she can read French. In 1685, she married Sir Francis Masham. He was a widower with 8 children who was a wealthy landowner. So, good news, you got money. Bad news, you're picking up 8 kids. She does bear a son, her only natural-born child of hers. And that takes place shortly after the marriage. She met John Locke at the age of 23. This is in 1682. Remember, she got married in 1685. She appears to have had a very romantic interest in him. And then he moved away to Holland in 1683. The group that's presenting next week may tell us why. When he moves away, they actually exchanged love poems and signed them with fake names. It was I tried to find some of these to show you, but I couldn't find any. I thought it'd be interesting to see what philosophers write as love poems. Later in life, in 1691, he moves into her estate and tutors her son. And he stays there until he dies. And when he dies, he gives away half of his inheritance to her son, because he has no children. He never marries. I was looking as hard as I could to see if there's any connection. Could this son secretly be John Locke's son? But I think I've been watching too many soap operas. I couldn't find it. So, probably not. She also has this correspondence with Leibniz. And interestingly, Leibniz initiates the conversation with her. That Leibniz does not assume that, or like she doesn't reach out to him, he comes to her. So that's really nice, actually, because women were not highly regarded, especially in academics at this time. Some people wonder if Leibniz had ulterior motives. Did Leibniz really care about her opinion, or was he trying to get in touch with, John Locke in some way? Or was he just trying to, because of her father, was it really about her father more than about her? She does write some philosophical books. They were both published anonymously, but the interesting thing was they were both attributed to Locke. Now, Locke is no small deal either. He's, after, I would say, in the history of British philosophy, he's probably the best, the greatest, the most well-known. For people to think that her writings were his is a very big compliment, I would say, to her. So she's a very good philosopher. She did also write a biography of Locke, and she may have written some other things as well. And actually, this second book I have up here is actually related. Actually, I think they both are. They're related to a controversy that she has with another of the women philosophers, another one of the women philosophers that we read out of here. And I'll mention that when we get there. I'll tell you what. Let's go ahead and take another break, and let's try to be back when this clock says 7:30, and then we will pick up with the text of Lady Masham.